Hello, fourth and fifth grade. This is the video for your social studies lesson this week. It's been a couple weeks since we've done social studies, and if you remember, we did the whole first chapter on the Midwest states with the geography, the early history, and like transportation and stuff. Then a couple weeks ago, we started the second chapter on the Midwest states, where it breaks that region into smaller regions. So there are 12 total Midwest states, and in the last lesson that you read, it broke them up into the Great Lakes states, and there were 6 of them. So half of them are considered Great Lakes states because they are around the Great Lakes, obviously. So the remaining 6 Midwest states are known as the Plains states. So if you look back on this year when we've talked about some of the major landforms in the United States, the Central Plains and the Great Plains are a big part of that, right? Along with, the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains and the oceans and things like that. So the Plains states, like I said, there's 6 of them, are Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. So these last 2 are neighbors to the east of our state of Montana. So we're getting closer and closer to where we live. And so you're going to also notice perhaps more similarities in the text to what you are used to around here. So you are going to read Lesson 2, The Plains States. It starts on page 282. And so you'll do your usual, read the little tan sidebar. The big question for this is that in what ways do people in cities, on farms, and on ranches in the Plains states depend on one another? Because sometimes when we think about like rural areas and urban areas, we think of them as being totally different and totally separate. But the reality is all different areas depend on one another. So if you live in a rural area, maybe you have a farm or a ranch, you still have some connections and dependence on perhaps more urban areas or cities. For example, if someone has a farm where they grow crops, those crops need to go somewhere to then be processed in some way and packaged and boxed up or whatever to then be sold in stores. And usually those kinds of food processing factories are in more urban or city areas. And obviously cities depend on rural areas, as far as raising the food that gets sold in the restaurants. So there's definitely a connection and a reliance going both ways. Okay, so you'll read the "you are there" part and kind of take a look at the image down here. This is in North Dakota, this picture is. So this first page is going to talk about just the wide open spaces that are in the Plains states and what the geography is kind of like. And then in this second section, you're going to read how the nature of this area really inspired artists, whether it's artists that were making paintings, or writing books, authors, and then also the art that's within the landscape. So for example, in South Dakota, that's where Mount Rushmore is, which is obviously the mountain that has a few of the president's faces carved in. We've talked about that. So so on this first page, pay attention to just the geography descriptions as well as the inspiration placed on artists and writers. Okay, on the next page, it's going to focus on farming. So obviously, farming from 100 years ago looks very different than it does today, thanks to advances in technology. So you're going to read about how farming has changed over time and what that means for the farming industry. Then over here, going from rural, we'll go to urban. You're going to read about the major cities that are in these Plains states. And this page will also talk about kind of that dependence that they both have on one another. So then on the final page, remember, we always have this global connection where they try to connect a place within the region we're reading about to somewhere else in the world. So if you remember, there was one where it compared the Mississippi River to the Rhine River over in another part of the world. So this global connection is going to take you to South America, specifically to the country of Argentina, and even more specifically to an area called the Pampas. So it's going to compare this place in Argentina to the Plains states that you're reading about today. So read everything very carefully. Make sure you have a good understanding of it. Your assignment today in your workbook will be page 81. We are skipping page 80, so don't worry about that, okay? So you're going to go over to page 81 where you see the illustration of Mount Rushmore and those presidents. And it just has 5 questions. And it says, for each of the following topics, write a sentence that shows what you learned about the Plains states. So it is super important that you are using actual text evidence. You're not just making up random stuff. So for example, number 1 says, physical features of the Plains states. So you're going to write a sentence using text evidence that states something that you learned from this lesson about the physical features of the Plains states. So in other words, the geography, what's the land like? So that's probably going to be on the very first page that we read. Number 2 is artists from the Plains states. If you remember, I pointed out that one section on that first page, page 283, where it talked about how the land has inspired artists and writers. So find something interesting from the text and just write a sentence to show something you've learned, okay? So there's 5 of those situations. New ways of farming, urbanization, that just means cities, and then the Pampas, so that's the place in Argentina. So again, you're just writing sentences reflecting something that you've learned in these categories, you could say. Please remember to write proper sentences with capitals and periods and to use text evidence to prove you've learned. Okay? All right, that's it for social studies this week. Thanks.